Starfield is the most classic Bethesda game ever. It contains all the trademark elements of a Bethesda RPG, but by 2026, that's no longer enough. Making a game wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle felt ambitious in 2006, but not today. This is why Starfield is SlopSterpice. Starfield tries to be about space exploration, yet space feels empty and uninteresting. Bethesda explains this as realism, but is that honesty or an excuse for weak world building? Don't forget that all Bethesda-created universes are extremely generic. Their gimmick has always been that you can live out your fantasy in these settings. As a reminder, Fallout wasn't created by Bethesda. They bought the franchise. The core gameplay in Starfield is shooting, but it's far from top tier. Bethesda says it's an RPG, so combat isn't the focus. But is that a valid point, or covering a weakness? In the past, Bethesda's weak combat had little competition. Now there are many RPGs with strong gameplay. Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk 2077, and more. Maybe the focus in Starfield is story and world, but characters feel flat, and major events have already happened before the player arrives. Bethesda encourages players to create their own adventures, yet the world doesn't feel alive. Weak storytelling, once overlooked, no longer works in a market full of story-rich RPGs. Like Kingdom Come Deliverance, Tainted Grail. Maybe Starfield's strengths may be crafting and survival, but games like No Man's Sky and even the unfinished Star Citizen put Starfield to shame in every way, and I am not even going to talk about Starfield's graphics and animations. The description of Starfield's components might give the impression that this game is as wide as an ocean, but the problem is that it's as deep as a spoon. As I said at the beginning of the video, that worked in 2006, but not now. Modern games have taken Bethesda's strengths and improved them significantly. 150 hours. That's not a number I'm proud of, but it's an honest one. I've sunk 150 hours into Starfield on PS5. This isn't a review written after 10 hours by someone who bounced off the opening and decided they'd seen enough. I've done the main quest. I've done most of the faction quests. I've built outposts. I've collected ships. I've modded weapons. I've stared at the star map more times than I've stared at actual stars in my real life. I know this game. And knowing it fully is precisely what makes it so frustrating. Because the more you know Starfield, the more you understand that it is a game pretending to be something it fundamentally isn't. And Bethesda either doesn't realize this or doesn't know how to fix it. Let's start with the most obvious and most discussed problem, because you can't talk about Starfield without talking about the loading screens. Playing on PS5 after patches, the load times are better. I'll give credit where it's due. They're not the absolute embarrassment they apparently were at launch on other platforms. But here's the thing nobody wants to say directly. The loading screens aren't just a technical inconvenience. They are a symptom of a fundamental design philosophy that makes the entire game feel hollow. Every location in Starfield is a box. A beautiful, sometimes incredibly detailed box, but a box. You walk around inside it, then you press a button. Then another box loads. There is no continuous world here. There is no sense that these places exist in relation to one another in any physical or meaningful way. You are essentially clicking through a PowerPoint presentation of a space game, and no matter how good the individual slides look, it never feels like a universe. Compare this to something like No Man's Sky, a game that launched as arguably the biggest disappointment in gaming history and has since become one of the most remarkable redemption stories. No Man's Sky lets you get in your ship, fly up from a planet's surface, break atmosphere, drift through actual space, and land somewhere else. The transition is seamless. The sense of scale is real. You feel the distance. Hello Games, with a fraction of Bethesda's resources and a fraction of their staff, managed to build a universe that actually feels like a universe. Starfield, with hundreds of millions of dollars and the studio that made Skyrim, gives you a fast travel menu dressed up in a spaceship cockpit. You sit in your ship, you press a button, a fake animation plays, and you're somewhere else. The universe doesn't exist between those points. It's a series of disconnected rooms with space wallpaper visible through the windows. And look, I I understand the argument Bethesda fans will make, which is that Starfield isn't trying to be No Man's Sky, it's trying to be a deep RPG with rich storytelling and meaningful choices. Fine, let's go there. Let's talk about the RPG side of the game, because this is where Starfield's pretense of ambition really starts to unravel. The character building in Starfield appears robust on the surface. There are traits, backgrounds, skills organized into trees, and a leveling system that rewards you for actually using abilities. I enjoyed the early stages of building my character. The backgrounds in particular seemed like a genuinely interesting idea. You pick a profession, you get some starting skills, and you get a few unique dialogue lines scattered throughout the game that reflect your history. I was a soldier. Occasionally, someone would comment on my military background. That's nice. That's world building through character history. I appreciated it. And then I noticed that these background-specific moments are extremely, painfully sparse. Hours would pass without any acknowledgement of who I was supposed to be. The background system is a thin coat of paint over a character creator that ultimately doesn't care who you are, because the game's writing isn't sophisticated enough to respond to you in any meaningful way. This is the central lie of a Bethesda RPG in 2024. The lie is that you're playing your character. The truth is that you're playing the Bethesda protagonist, who is a blank vessel designed to receive quests and return to quest givers with completed quest items. Your choices matter at the margins. You can choose to be good or evil in individual interactions. You can choose which faction to ally with. You can choose whether to unlock a door by hacking it or picking it or just shooting the person behind it. But the world doesn't respond to you as a person. The universe doesn't reshape itself around your decisions in any way that feels significant. Baldur's Gate 3 raised the bar here so astronomically that it's almost impossible to play a game like Starfield in its wake without feeling the gap. I think about moments in Baldur's Gate 3 that I still talk about with friends. The way a character remembers things you told them 50 hours earlier. The way choosing a certain class or background opens up entirely different solutions to problems. The way the world physically changes based on your choices, not just in terms of which faction controls a location, but in terms of what that location looks, sounds, and feels like. Characters have their own goals that they pursue independently of you. The game has genuine consequence. In Starfield, I made a major faction decision about 2/3 of the way through the game and then waited to see what would change. The answer was almost nothing. Some people said different things to me when I talked to them. The fundamental experience of existing in the world was identical. The companions don't help here. They are competent, they are well-voiced, and some of them have individual moments that are genuinely charming. Sam Coe grew on me. I liked his relationship with his daughter. But these companions exist primarily as skill bonuses and romance options, which is the Bethesda companion design philosophy in a nutshell. They follow you. They comment on things. They occasionally say something that makes you feel a small flash of something. And then you realize they have no real agency, no real arc that responds to your journey specifically, no ability to surprise you in any meaningful way. Compare them to Asterion, Shadowheart, Karlach, characters whose entire personalities shift based on your relationship with them and the choices you make together. Characters who feel like they have lives outside of helping you collect quest items. Bethesda's companions feel like extremely well-made NPCs. BG3's companions feel like people. Now let's talk about the actual story, because I think this is where Starfield reveals most clearly what kind of game it actually is versus what it wants you to think it is. The Constellation storyline is built around a concept that should be philosophically interesting: the unity, the multiverse, the idea that the artifacts are doorways to different versions of the universe. This is genuinely cool science fiction territory. I was engaged early on. The mystery story felt real. And then the game started answering its own questions, and every answer was less interesting than the question that preceded it. The Unity is a reset button. The artifacts are cosmic MacGuffins. The Starborn, the antagonists of the story, turn out to be previous player characters from previous cycles, which is a genuinely clever idea that the game does essentially nothing interesting with. The main quest peaks conceptually around the midpoint, and then coasts downhill on vibes until the ending, which gives you a choice between things that don't feel meaningfully different. The New Game Plus system is where Bethesda put its narrative chips, and I understand why, in theory. The idea is that replaying the game as a Starborn, with knowledge of previous cycles and different dialogue options, is where the real story lives. This is interesting as a concept. In practice, it asks you to replay the entire game with the same structure to experience incremental variations on the same content. I did one NG Plus run. I got a slightly different apartment. Some NPCs said slightly different things. I stopped after 12 hours because I realized I was doing it not because it was fun, but because I was hoping to find the depth I'd been looking for in the first playthrough. The exploration is where Starfield's specific brand of failure is most visible and most painful, because exploration is supposed to be the heart of this kind of game. This is Bethesda's genre. They invented what it means to discover a dungeon in a video game, to walk into a ruin and feel the weight of a civilization that used to be there. Skyrim's dungeons are designed pieces of environmental storytelling. Fallout 4's settlements, despite that game's many problems, have specific histories you can read through objects and terminal entries and the way space is arranged. There is craft in those locations. You feel that craft as discovery. In Starfield, there are approximately 1,000 planets you can visit. This number is not a selling point, it is a confession. A confession that the team either didn't have time or didn't have the capacity to fill all of this space with things worth finding. And rather than make a smaller, denser universe, they made an enormous, empty one and hoped the scale itself would feel like content. I landed on dozens of planets across my 150 hours. The majority of them had surface variations, some interesting geology, occasionally a strange creature, and then the same prefabricated structures repeated across the landscape. The abandoned research station on one planet is the same abandoned research station on every planet. The pirate base has the same layout. The UC outpost has the same rooms. There are only so many of these tiles, and you start recognizing them around the 20-hour mark, and after that, every new planet is no longer a discovery. It's a confirmation of something you already knew. This is the No Man's Sky problem without the No Man's Sky solution. Hello Games made their game feel alive through systems, weather systems, creature behavior systems, ecosystem logic that makes each planet feel like it has internal rules even when it's procedurally generated. Starfield's procedural generation is surface level. It moves rocks and trees and biome textures around, but the actual content underneath, the buildings, the enemies, the items, remains stubbornly handcrafted in the worst possible way, which is handcrafted once and then copy-pasted everywhere. The universe doesn't breathe, it tiles. And then there's the NASA punk aesthetic, which I want to spend some time on because I think it reveals something important about what Bethesda was actually trying to do with this game's identity. NASA punk is a real aesthetic movement with genuine philosophical depth. It's about the romance of practical space exploration. The idea that the future might look like the Apollo program, functional and imperfect and beautiful in its functionality. Rivets and Velcro and analog dials alongside laser rifles. It's a response to the sleek sterility of most science fiction, an argument that the texture of real engineering is more interesting than the smooth perfection of Star Trek. Starfield uses this aesthetic as wallpaper. The ships look great. The spacesuits have that wonderful utilitarian detail. Some of the space stations have a genuinely lived-in quality that made me stop and look around just to absorb the visual design. But the aesthetic is doing work that the world building can't do. do. NASA punk in a real science fiction context would imply a certain kind of universe, one grounded in political reality, resource scarcity, ideological conflict rooted in genuine human concerns. And there are gestures toward this in Starfield. The UC Freestar conflict has the skeleton of an interesting Cold War allegory. Neon has the bones of a cyberpunk corporate hellhole. But none of these ideas are developed past the point where they create an interesting backdrop for fetch quests. Compare the world building of Starfield's factions to something like The Outer Worlds, which, for all its own problems, understood that if you're going to make a game about corporate space colonialism, you have to commit to the bit. The Outer Worlds had genuine satirical teeth. Its factions felt like they had consistent internal logic, economic motivations, ideological contradictions. Starfield's factions feel like quest hubs that have been given names and color palettes. The UC is good but bureaucratic. The Freestar Collective is cowboys but libertarian. Ryujin Industries is evil but in a vague corporate way. These are signifiers of depth rather than actual depth. NASA punk gives the game a look, but a look can't substitute for a universe with real texture. I think what frustrates me most about all of this is that I can see the game Bethesda wanted to make. I can see the dream of it in the edges and fragments. There are individual quests in Starfield that are genuinely excellent. The Neon quest line has moments that surprised me with their moral complexity. The UC Vanguard storyline has a revelation in the third act that hit harder than anything in the main story. The Crimson Fleet quests gave me the closest thing the game has to a choice that felt like it actually mattered. These are the moments where I understood why Bethesda still has passionate defenders, because when this studio is firing on all cylinders at the level of individual quest design, they can still write something that makes you sit back and feel something. But those moments exist in a game that spends the vast majority of its runtime asking you to open your map, hold a button to fast travel into orbit, bring up the star map, hold another button to travel to another system, click on a planet, click on a landing location, watch an animation, and then walk 50 feet across a surface to enter a building you've entered 12 times before. The friction of actually moving through this universe doesn't create a sense of adventure. It creates a sense of chores. And after 150 hours, I can tell you that the chore feeling never fully goes away. It just gets normalized, which might be the saddest thing I can say about the experience. Let me talk about the combat for a moment, because this is an area where I feel like the conversation around Starfield has been too kind. The shooting feels serviceable. The guns have weight. The enemy variety is acceptable. Comparing it to what other RPGs are doing with their action systems right now, it feels like a game from a different era and not in a charming retro way. Look at what Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is doing. This is a game made by a small studio that has openly cited Bethesda as a primary influence. It's using the same open-world structure, the same first-person exploration, the same emphasis on environmental storytelling. And even at its early access stage, it's innovating on the combat in ways Bethesda hasn't attempted in 15 years. The dodge timing matters. Positioning matters. Enemies have meaningful behavioral patterns that you learn and exploit. The encounters feel designed rather than spawned. When a game that is explicitly trying to be Bethesda but better is already outpacing its inspiration in moment-to-moment gameplay feel, that tells you something important about where Bethesda has stagnated. Elden Ring changed the conversation about what it means to fight enemies in an open world. Black Myth Wukong showed that action in an RPG can be a deeply expressive system. Even games that aren't primarily action games, like Baldur's Gate 3, have combat systems with enormous tactical depth that reward genuine engagement. Starfield's combat is fine. It's Fallout 4 in space without VATS, which would be acceptable if the rest of the game was filling in the gaps. perhaps, but the rest of the game is also just fine. And fine across every dimension adds up to something less than the sum of its parts. I want to address the elephant in the room, which is the question of who Starfield is actually for. On its surface, the answer seems obvious. It's for people who loved Skyrim and Fallout, who want a huge world to lose themselves in, who enjoy the specific pleasure of wandering into a cave they didn't know was there and finding something unexpected inside. And at launch, the marketing presented it as exactly that, but bigger and more ambitious than anything Bethesda had done before. Thousands of planets, infinite exploration, your story. But here's what I actually think is happening. I think Starfield is a game that was designed to be accessible to everyone, and as a consequence became genuinely appealing to almost no one for very long. There's no real challenge for players who want challenge. The combat can be made easy almost accidentally through skill investment. The exploration doesn't require or reward any particular skill. The crafting and outpost building systems are robust enough to suggest a builder's game, but underdeveloped enough to disappoint anyone who actually wanted that experience. The story gestures at philosophical depth, but delivers airport thriller plotting. Every system has been sanded down to the point where it creates no friction for the casual player and no satisfaction for the dedicated one. This is the trap of designing for everyone. You end up designing for no one. Elder Scrolls games had this problem too, but they compensated with world density and discovery quality and a sense of place so strong that even a shallow RPG system could carry you for hundreds of hours on atmosphere alone. Skyrim's RPG mechanics are laughably thin by the standards of the genre, but Skyrim's world is so vividly itself that the mechanical thinness doesn't matter as much. You're not there to min-max, you're there to be a dragonborn in a world that feels ancient and alive. Starfield's world, despite its enormity, doesn't feel alive in the same way. The NASA punk aesthetic is beautiful, but it doesn't generate the same emotional pull. Space is vast and cold by definition, and Starfield never quite figures out how to make that vastness feel welcoming rather than empty. There's also something I need to say about the way Bethesda's formula specifically doesn't translate to a space setting, which I think is part of why this game feels so fundamentally off even when individual pieces of it work. The Bethesda magic, if you want to call it that, has always been about a specific kind of discovery. You're walking across a landscape. There's a tower in the distance. You walk toward it. Something is there. This works in a fantasy landscape because the human eye is drawn to landmarks, because forests and mountains and ruined keeps create a visual vocabulary of adventure that is primal and deeply embedded. It works in a post-apocalyptic landscape because every ruined building is a mystery. What was this? What happened here? What's left? The visual language creates narrative questions that the world then answers. Space doesn't work this way. From orbit, a planet looks like a sphere. You land on a surface. If the surface isn't pre-populated with something interesting, all you see is terrain. The sense of wonder that comes from seeing a tower on the horizon and walking to it doesn't translate to landing a ship and walking 100 meters to a waypoint. The navigation paradigm is fundamentally different, and Bethesda never found a way to adapt their discovery formula to it. You're not pulled toward things in Starfield, you're teleported to things and then walk the last small distance. The adventure happens in menus rather than in space. 150 hours in, I've come to a conclusion about what Bethesda actually is in 2024, and it's not a flattering one. Bethesda is a studio that pioneered a genre and then watched as that genre evolved around them while they stood still. The specific pleasure they sell, which is the big open world with lots of stuff in it and light role-playing elements, has been replicated and surpassed by other studios in almost every dimension. You want world density and faction depth? CD Projekt Red. You want meaningful choices and reactive storytelling? Larian Studios. You want seamless open-world exploration at scale? Hello Games. You want the Bethesda structure but with better combat? From Software did something adjacent to this and changed gaming. Even smaller studios doing throwback Bethesda games are innovating faster than Bethesda themselves. What Bethesda still has has, and this is genuinely valuable, is modding. The construction kit. The community of creators who have spent decades learning how to extend and improve these games. Skyrim is still being played by enormous numbers of people primarily because of what the community has built on top of it. This is a real and significant achievement. But it's also an acknowledgement that the base game is a foundation rather than a finished product, and I think Starfield's relationship to its modding community will follow the same pattern. In 3 years, there will probably be Starfield mod compilations that make the game into something genuinely extraordinary, that fill the empty planets with handcrafted content, that add new systems and deeper faction mechanics and better combat. The community will finish the game Bethesda couldn't, which is its own kind of sad. I've been trying to figure out exactly what the core failure of Starfield is, because I think it's more specific than just too big, too shallow. I think the core failure is that Bethesda tried to make a space exploration fantasy without ever honestly interrogating what that fantasy actually is. What do people actually want to feel when they play a space exploration game? They want to feel small and significant at the same time. They want the universe to be vast and themselves to be the center of it. They want wonder, which is different from content. Wonder is what you feel when you encounter something that changes your understanding of the world you're in. Content is what you consume. Starfield generates content at an almost incomprehensible scale. It generates genuine wonder almost never. The moments that came closest for me were specific. Standing on a tidally locked world and watching the same star frozen on the horizon, the day and night sides creating a dramatic divide across the landscape. That was wonder. Finding a derelict ship floating in orbit, boarding it, and piecing together from environmental details what had happened to its crew. That was wonder. A specific conversation in the UC Vanguard quest where a character said something that reframed everything I'd understood about the lore up to that point. That was wonder. These moments exist. They're real. They're why I kept playing past the point where a rational person might have stopped. But they're scattered through a game that mostly asks you to hold a button and wait, to navigate menus that represent navigation, to visit the 153rd planet that generates the same scan data as the 152nd planet. The wonder-to-chore ratio is deeply unfavorable, and no amount of patching changes that because it's not a technical problem. It's a design problem. It's a question of what the team believed the game should feel like at its core, and the answer they arrived at is a game that feels like it's showing you a lot of things rather than making you feel a lot of things. I don't regret my 150 hours entirely. That would be too simple. I regret the expectation I brought to them, the belief that if I kept going, the game would become what it seemed to promise it could be. Instead, I came out the other side understanding Starfield for what it is, a technically impressive, occasionally brilliant, fundamentally dishonest piece of work. Dishonest not in the sense of lying to you maliciously, but in the deeper sense of not fully knowing itself. Starfield doesn't know what it wants to be. It wants to be everything, and it knows how to be almost none of the things it wants to be, as well as games that have chosen a lane and committed to it. The trash part of SlopSterpice is the empty planets, the repeated tiles, the shallow systems, the story that undercuts itself, the combat that hasn't evolved, the exploration fantasy built on loading screens, the companions who are pleasant company but not real people, the faction quests that hint at depth and then retreat to safety. The masterpiece part, or at least the near masterpiece part, is scattered through it in fragments. The best individual quest designs, the visual world building, the ship customization, which is genuinely the most fun system in the game, the audio design, which is consistently excellent, the specific moments of genuine science fiction wonder that the game is capable of when it's not undermining itself. Maybe the most honest thing I can say about Starfield is that it made me appreciate other games more. After sinking those hours into it, I went back to games that had committed to specific visions, games that knew exactly what fantasy they were selling and delivered it with craft. And the contrast was stark. Those games felt dense and purposeful in a way that Starfield, for all its scale, never quite managed. Bethesda built a universe. They just forgot to make it feel like one.